Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending upon where you are. I'm Bob Hamilton, the head of Eurasia Research at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And today we have a really distinguished panel to discuss our latest report on the Chinese-Russian relationship in Central Asia. And the report talks about the fact that there's a transition in power potentially underway as Russian power declines relative to Chinese power, and whether the two can manage that. Thanks to the Russia Strategic Initiative at U.S. European Command for sponsoring this report and the two previous ones, where we had events for those last month and the month before. Participants, please put your questions in the Q&A box. And I will now turn it over to Dr. Michael Rowland from the Russia Strategic Initiative, our moderator. Michael, over to you.
All right, thank you, Bob. This is a real privilege to moderate this important discussion on Central Asia, and we appreciate our partnership with FPRI. So how this event's going to work today, we're going to have a short presentation on the report, and then we'll be followed by three commentators who will comment for about 5 minutes each on the report. So our first speaker will be Dr. Robert Hamilton. He is the head of research at the Foreign Policy Research Institute's Eurasia program. In a 30-year career in the U.S. Army, he served overseas in multiple posts, including Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Qatar, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Kuwait, Georgia, Germany, and Belarus. I reorganized them a little bit geographically. He also served as an associate professor of Eurasian studies at the U.S. Army War College. Dr. Hamilton is the author of numerous articles and monographs on conflict and security studies, focusing primarily on the former Soviet Union and the Balkans. He will be followed by three commentators. Our first commentator will be Professor Edward Lemon, who teaches at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University here in Washington, D.C. And he's the president of the Oxus Society of Central Asian Affairs. His research interests include global authoritarianism, security issues, and Russia and China's influence in Central Asia. He's recently the editor of Critical Approaches to Security in Central Asia, which was published with Routledge Press. Our second commentator will be Aizada Nuridinova, an assistant professor at the Department of Social Sciences at Suleiman Demirel University in Kazakhstan. Currently, she's a visiting scholar at George Washington University, and she holds a PhD in international relations and Chinese foreign policy from the School of International Public Affairs at Jilin University in China. Her research interests are centered on Chinese foreign policy and regionalism in Central Asia. And our third and final commentator will be Dr. Akram Umarov. He's the first vice rector of the University of World Economy and Diplomacy. He is also affiliated with the Institute for Advanced International Studies in Tashkent, Uzbekistan. Recently, he was a Fulbright visiting scholar at the University of Pittsburgh, and he has been the senior research fellow at the Institute for Strategic and Regional Studies and as well as the Academy of Public Administration under the president of Uzbekistan. His research interests include security, conflict management, and development studies in Central Asia, Afghanistan, and the former post-Soviet space. So with those introductions out of the way, I'll turn it back over to you, Bob.
Okay, thank you, Michael. I guess I'll start by saying, if you're here hoping for simple categorical assessment of the Russia-China relationship in Central Asia, you're unfortunately going to be disappointed. I don't think it's easy to categorize it. And I think the two sort of narratives you hear pretty often about strategic partnership or access and convenience actually are not all that. They're useful, but they're not as descriptive, I think, as they need to be. It's neither of those. And especially in Central Asia, it's neither of those. It's complex, it's dynamic, it's contingent, and contingency happens on the ground. And so the idea here is to take a region like Central Asia, where they both have important interests at stake, see how they interact there, and then try to draw lessons from that interaction about their more general relationship. So why does Central Asia matter so much to Russia and China? I'd say there's four major reasons. First, it's geographically contiguous to both. It's between China and Russia. Secondly, both have important, if not vital, interests at stake there, both security and economic interests, both. The third reason, looking at ourselves, is the U.S. footprint there. The U.S. presence there is fairly light compared to other regions of the world, for instance, Eastern Europe or East Asia, where China and Russia have important interests. And so the U.S. has been called the binding agent in the China-Russia relationship. So the idea here is that the light U.S. footprint removes that binding agent and allows us to see how they interact without the US or shared resistance to the US or shared resistance to the West more generally driving them together. And then the final reason, and this is contained in the title of the report, is there's a power transition underway. We can talk about how durable that power transition is and how inevitable it is that China will rise and Russia's power will decline relative to China in the region. But for now, at least, there is a transition in power underway as Russia's power declines relative to that of China. Power transitions are notoriously hard to manage, even for countries that have very friendly relationships over centuries. And Russia and China, frankly, don't have that. So the report we're discussing here, which should be available on the website, FPRI website, in a few weeks, examines the relationship by looking at their influence, their interests, their use of what we call the instruments of power, diplomatic, military, and economic instruments, and then concludes by looking at areas where their interests are convergent and divergent. And that gives us some things to watch for going forward. So real quickly, I'll start here. And again, I'll limit this to 8 to 10 minutes. And then if there are specific issues or questions about certain things I've said, we can get into those in the discussion in the Q&A. In terms of influence, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has damaged Russia's reputation as a security provider. It eroded faith in its military capability and has heightened suspicion of its motives, especially in Kazakhstan. China is the most obvious beneficiary of Russia's decline, but faces headwinds. A lot of people in Central Asia, and maybe some of the governments, fear being swallowed economically and demographically by China. In some ways, their influence are mirror images of each other. Russia has soft power with publics in Central Asia built up over centuries of a relationship with the region, mostly in the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, of controlling the region, of ruling the region. But there's rising distrust among elites in the region toward Russia, whereas China is gaining influence with elites, primarily through things like investment, economic development, the Belt and Road Initiative, but faces suspicion from publics in the region. So there's sort of a mirror imaging of their influence going on there. In terms of interests, so China's are fairly straightforward. Their economic interests focus on development and access to raw materials. The latter is obvious. China needs access to Central Asia's raw materials to fuel its export-driven economy. The development angle is not quite so obvious, but the reason China focuses so much on economic development in Central Asia is the Chinese Communist Party believes that economic development is an essential precondition for political and social stability. And without economic development, without sort of rising economic tides, that political and social stability are at risk. This is especially important to China because Central Asia borders the least developed and least stable region of China, primarily Xinjiang, Western China, that borders Central Asia. China's security interests, again, in some ways, mostly negative security interests. Beijing sees Central Asia as a potential source of insecurity through religious extremism and separatism, especially since there are ethnic and religious links between Xinjiang and the Central Asian region, and the possible transmission belt of the same things, extremism, religious extremism, and terrorism from Afghanistan. Russia has long seen Central Asia as its soft underbelly in a security sense due to a long, sparsely populated border with the region, and the fact that the region has been, and southern Russia has been a historical pathway for invasion, going all the way back to the Mongol invasion of the 13th century, which essentially controlled most of what's now Russia for 2.5 centuries. Russia also has important economic and security interests in Central Asia, but instead of focusing on economic development as a precursor to security, the Kremlin really asserts security interests more directly through military presence. We can get into a little bit of that in the discussion, exactly what the Russian military presence is there for and the size of it. And now in terms of diplomatic, military, and economic instruments. So diplomacy, you're seeing from China an increasing pace and intensity of their diplomatic presence and engagements, an increasing willingness to engage Central Asian states bilaterally and in multilateral formats that don't include Russia. For a very long time, probably at least the first 2.5 decades after Central Asia gained independence, China was very deferential to Russia diplomatically, and it avoided overtly engaging the Central Asian states diplomatically in ways that excluded Russia. It no longer does that, both bilaterally and multilateral formats like the Tian format. It's engaging the Central Asian states directly. Diplomatically, Russia had a big head start due to the Soviet linkages and even the Russian imperial presence there. This is eroding because of the Ukraine war and the perception that Russia doesn't respect sovereignty of regional states. There's a large increase, though, in the pace of Russian diplomatic activity since the Ukraine war started to show that Russia is not isolated and also to recover some of its lost diplomatic influence. People who follow the region will remember that all 5 Central Asian leaders went to Moscow for the Victory Day parade this year. That was seen as an indication that Russia still at least has some pretty significant residual diplomatic weight. Militarily, Chinese presence in Central Asia is important. It's unconventional. It's mostly in the form of, so only the second base outside China's borders is in Central Asia. It's in Tajikistan. After 5 or so years of denying its existence, both the Tajik and Chinese governments have now been forced to acknowledge it's there. It's not the People's Liberation Army, it's the People's Armed Police, so it's not a conventional military presence, but it does look set to expand. China also has a very large presence of private military and security contractors. So these companies that provide security, and they mostly provide security for China's economic interests in Central Asia, BRI projects and other investments, but more and more now, they're armed. They're able to carry weapons by agreements with Central Asian governments. So China's presence is much smaller. Security presence is smaller and more unconventional, not conventional military than Russia's, but it's there and it's expanding. Russia had a huge lead in terms of conventional military presence. It's still got something like 7,000 soldiers in Tajikistan. I'm not exactly sure how many, if any, have left since Ukraine, but it had at the start of the Ukraine war 7,000 strong contingent in Tajikistan, about 500 at Kant Air Base in Kyrgyzstan, and then military and space facilities in Kazakhstan. And then I'll conclude by saying this. It's in the economic realm where competition is most apparent. So in the economic instrument, Central Asia is central to the BRI. It's central to the Belt and Road Initiative for China because of this development security linkage that Beijing believes in, that economic development is an important precursor to security. So from 2005 to 2023, China invested somewhere around $70 billion in Central Asia, of which over $37 billion went to Kazakhstan. Nobody else is going to put that kind of money into the region. Nobody else has that kind of money to spend, including Western countries and governments. Trade with Central Asia also topped $70 billion in 2022, 8 years earlier than the target that Xi Jinping had set. And China is the largest trade partner for all of the countries, but Kazakhstan will likely pass Russia there fairly soon. Russia benefited from the Soviet economic structure, which tied Central Asia to Russia, but China is really pulling the region into its orbit and out of Russia's. And then the final thing I would say is the 2 sort of major economic projects in the region, the Eurasian Economic Union and the Silk Road Economic Belt, which is the Central Asian component of the BRI, are incompatible. The first, the Russian Eurasian Economic Union, is a closed customs union with Russia at its center, and the BRI, the Silk Road Economic Belt, is an attempt to establish an open global trading system with China at its center and Central Asia as a key component of it. So these 2 things, economic visions for the region, are incompatible. And I think that on its own, so the economic instrument is where there's competition is most apparent. I think on its own, this economic competition might not be that dangerous to the relationship, but in the context of an overall transition in power and in the context of a fairly light Western and especially US footprint, and so there's no one there to drive them together, I think it's more likely that you could see economic competition leading to overall competition between China and Russia in the region. And I'll stop there and turn it back over, Michael, to you.
Okay, thank you. Over to you, Ed.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Bob, for the invitation and the opportunity to read your report. I think it's an excellent primer on these evolving relations that I think many people will find very useful. And it certainly chimes with research that I've been involved in over the past few years on various both published and unpublished reports, looking at this very same issue of how are these relationships evolving, how is the war in Ukraine having an impact, and the general conclusion of those reports certainly chimed with your findings insofar as many of the respondents and expert opinions were trending in the direction of increasing competition and arguing that the war in Ukraine didn't so much transform China's role in the region and Russia's role in the region, but certainly accelerated pre-existing trends towards China's rising role and Russia's ultimate declining role in the region. Things, as you said, like China being less deferential to Russia in its relations, increasingly positioning itself as an alternative provider of support, and building up its own parallel institutions such as the China plus Central Asia format that was modeled in many ways on the C5+1 and other initiatives by Japan and Korea and other countries that was elevated to the full head of states level in the meeting in May 2023 in Xi'an last year. I just, in my very brief comments over the next 5 minutes, wanted to kind of zoom out and look at what this means for Central Asia. The report a number of times picks up on the Central Asian responses to this growing competition between China and Russia in Central Asia. And I wanted to reflect a little bit on how Central Asia is responding and thinking through 4 different strategies that they're adopting to find a way to cope and take advantage of potentially and exercise their agency in this growing era of global great power competition and competition within the region itself. Certainly the international system is hierarchical, and so great powers in many ways, as we've always argued, they pursue what they want, and small states have to look for what they can do. And so I'm going to talk about 4 different strategies that the Central Asian countries are pursuing in response to the developments that you talk about in the report. The first is in many ways one that they're utilizing in response to Ukraine, which could be described as buck passing or ducking, in which it's a passive strategy whereby they, for example, miss in the case of Turkmenistan or abstain from different votes regarding Ukraine at the United Nations in an effort to maintain their neutrality and avoid directly confronting Russia on this issue. A second and linked strategy to buck passing or ducking is hedging. Right? This is an alternative to balancing against Russia or China that we haven't seen the countries in the region doing, or ultimately bandwagoning or choosing sides. And I think it's very important to note that the Central Asian republics within this growing great power competition want to avoid having to pick a side on which they want to be. They want to pursue this multi-vector foreign policy that I would say is a policy of hedging, whereby they pursue relations with multiple different power centers, including Moscow, Beijing, but also more broadly, Washington, Brussels, the Gulf states, Japan, Korea, and so on and so forth. And this is really an insurance-seeking response to this growing great power competition, where they can signal ambiguity to different powers and power blocks and maintain the maximum strategic autonomy in their foreign policy making. And so this multi-vector foreign policy is something that each of the Central Asian republics is pursuing in response to this growing great power competition. The third strategy I want to pick up on is something that we've seen increasingly in recent years, particularly since 2016, with the death of Shavkat Mirziyoyev, death of Islam Karimov, in Uzbekistan, and Shavkat Mirziyoyev coming to power, which is this process of increasing regionalism in the region. And Aizada wrote a wonderful paper, co-authored one paper with Janibek Karimov recently on this, where they built a data set of regional interactions and meetings between Central Asian leaders. We've seen, for example, an increase from 60 interactions at the head of state and head of government level in 2015 up to 158 meetings in 2023 alone. So it's almost a tripling of the number of meetings taking place. Things like the first meetings between heads of state that are occurring on an annual basis. And this really is partly about regional cooperation, but there is an element to which this is also about cooperating to strengthen strategic autonomy and independence from over-reliance on any one external power. And so we've seen a number of security exercises between the different countries in the region, and we've seen the signing and ratification on the Kazakh side earlier this year of a treaty of allied relations between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan that includes some mutual defense clauses. So really we're seeing the region increasingly taking greater agency in response to this rising Chinese and declining Russian role in the region. And finally, we're seeing them also pursuing strategies of bridging. As Bob mentioned in his presentation, of course, the region is landlocked, and that is in many ways strategically disadvantageous to the region, but it's trying to position itself as a transit hub, and this is where it's aligned in many ways, particularly more so with China than Russia in its BRI project and desire to diversify transit routes through the region to avoid Russia and Ukraine. And the region's also taking advantage of its strategic location, bordering both of these great powers to also become involved in various practices of sanctions evasion, such as secondary exports. And so in general, just to conclude, this rising Chinese-Russian competition in the region would be strategically have some advantages in bolstering the agency of the Central Asian republics as they look to potentially play off alternative patrons against one another, look to find ways to take advantage of this situation. But I see my 5 minutes is up, so I'll leave it there and hand over to the next commentator.
Thank you, Ed. Aizana?
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm very glad to be part of this great panel. Thank you, Robert, for providing a very up-to-date and thorough analysis on the topic. Before I go to the comments, I think I can provide a very quick update. Actually, as a result of 2023, China has replaced Kazakhstan as China has replaced Russia as Kazakhstan's top trading partner. So I think it was just a matter of time if we look at previous statistics in terms of trade. I would like to comment on 3 points. First, regarding Chinese and Russian influence in Central Asia. So the argument in the report is that Russia deeply damaged its reputation in Central Asia, while China still faces its own societal distrust in Central Asian countries. I couldn't agree more that Russia's invasion of Ukraine damaged its reputation in Central Asia by generating larger and deeper public discussion and public reflections on decolonization and language issues. But I think we still should have maybe a nuanced approach. For example, in Kazakhstan, the public is quite diverse, and a recent study by Azamat Junisbay shows that language and age in Kazakhstan make a difference. The study found that Russian-speaking older generation, I think 50 years and plus, they seem to be open to Russian narratives regarding its war in Ukraine. And it turns out that they consume news mainly from Russian TV channels. And so the people's news consumption habits are important there. Regarding China's image in Central Asia, I think there is an interesting puzzle. Report mentions the gap between the elite attitude and public elite approach and public attitude towards China in Central Asian countries. So the puzzle here is that this gap between the public and the elite, it persists despite China's increasing investments in its public diplomacy in the region. I think it stems from this cultural or even civilizational difference between the people in the Central Asian region and in China. So perhaps major takeaway that we can get from this is that cultural gap cannot be simply reduced by public diplomacy efforts in a short-term perspective. The second point is related to Russian interests in Central Asia. I think it's very useful that the report categorizes interests into 4 major types, such as survival, vital, important, and peripheral interests. So idea here that both China and Russia have important interests in Central Asia, if not vital. The notion here is that Russia considers Central Asia as its soft underbelly. But before that, I would rather say that Russia, first and foremost, looks at Central Asia as the part of its near abroad that gives it a great power status. And actually, it stems from Russia's spatial entitlement. And the third point is related to China's increasing engagement of Central Asian countries through formats that exclude Russia. And you mentioned ASEAN format. And I would like to expand on this a little bit. And we can certainly observe that China's engagement with Central Asia is being increasingly institutionalized beyond Shanghai Cooperation Organization as it used to be in the past. And China developed C5 plus China framework since 2020. And it's an exclusive format. It is separate from SCO as SCO becomes more complicated and more cumbersome as a result of its expansion. And it looks like its expansion is continuing. For example, Belarus is expected to become a full member at the Astana summit, which will be in July this year. So it looks like for both sides, for Central Asia and for China, it's quite convenient to have this format. And within this format, China can present itself as a norm maker. And specifically, China tries to promote its concept of community of common destiny, as it has appeared in Xi'an Declaration, and it is directed to its neighboring countries to ensure that China's peripheries are quite stable and conducive to its economic development. And lastly, as Edward mentioned, I would like to focus a little bit on the agency of Central Asian states. Maybe due to the scope of the report, it was deliberately excluded, but it would be great to see a section on how Central Asian countries are responding to these latest developments. But I think that in light of these developments, Central Asian countries are seeking to exercise their agency multilaterally, unilaterally, and bilaterally. And multilaterally, we can point out the emergence of the consultative meeting and its further maybe partial institutionalization with the creation of its secretariat. And as Edward mentioned, there is this rise of diplomatic engagements between Central Asian high-level officials. Unilaterally, I think that Central Asian states are pursuing hedging strategy, and specifically, if we look at the example of Kazakhstan, it looks like Kazakhstan is pursuing an equidistant diplomacy, which tries to appease its domestic audience, public, and also tries not to offend the regional actors. And bilaterally, there is an internal alliance building occurring in the region with several treaties and declarations being concluded on allied relations. So I think this last point is is an important development that we should pay attention to. So I'll stop there, and I can provide more comments later. Thank you.
Thank you, Aizada. And over to you, Akram.
Thank you for the kind invitation. I'm very delighted to be part of this brilliant panel. And maybe I'll be brief in focusing on a couple of issues which I think is relevant, but might not be very much in line with the conclusions of the report. First of all, I don't think Russia's role and presence in Central Asia decreased or declined in the recent years, especially after the war in Ukraine. I actually think it's actually increased, enhanced, because I think the reason, first of all, in general, for Russia, it's really important, especially in the current circumstances, to see Central Asia as a friendly region where they do not expect any challenges or threats. So there is a lot of focus now on Central Asia, especially considering the limited diplomatic interaction with European countries, with many Western countries. So there is many more opportunities for Russia to focus its diplomatic efforts and its diplomacy on regions like Central Asia. So I think actually in the recent years, diplomatic presence, activity of Russia in Central Asia increased substantially. And one of the samples is that Russia also established this Russia Central Asia C5+1 kind of format, which not used to be a priority for Russia before, because Moscow always underlined, emphasized on more significance for its foreign policy in the region, to focus more on bilateral relations, for multilateral exchange, to use the existing formats of Commonwealth of Independent States, Eurasian Economic Union, Collective Security Treaty Organization, etc. The ones which are led and which were actively established by Russia, not to create a new ones. But Russia also acknowledged the new realities, increased regionalism in Central Asia, and also proposed to establish this Russia Central Asia Forum. The next area I think is important, that it's more focused on diversification of cooperation. Before, for many years, I would say in Central Asia, Russia mostly focused, let's say, on areas like extraction of natural resources. There were more investments in the IT sector. I mean, why I see IT, I mean mostly telecommunication. And there were Russian mobile operators which invested and opened branches in Central Asia, and there were very limited investments into other sectors. But in the recent years, I think there are more diversification. There is more investments coming into the industrial areas, other industrial sections of Central Asian countries, into metal production, and there is more increased cooperation on different technological areas. So there is diversification of economic cooperation is increasing, and also the export from Central Asia to Russia also increased substantially in the recent years. The last point about Russian role is the thing again related to the idea that there is some limited presence and role of Russia, especially in the security area. I think again I wouldn't agree with this point. My observations demonstrate that actually the security cooperation is one of the main areas. There is a traditional cooperation between defense ministries, security, law enforcement agencies, and this cooperation is still going on. And besides, there are what is advantage of Russia in this regard, that it has many multilateral organizations, regional organizations focusing on security. Let's say on Shanghai Cooperation Organization, we may discuss the efficiency of it. there are some issues about the efficiency, delivery, outputs. I completely agree with it. But in general, in terms of institutionalizing this cooperation, Russia is very advanced compared to other partners. Or China can be also see, we can see China in Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but Russia has other mechanisms, like again, Collective Security Treaty Organization, Commonwealth of Independent States, which has the summits of defense ministries, interior ministers, general prosecutors, and also have anti-terrorist center, which is again a lot of questions about its efficiency, but still there is mechanisms which are functioning. Regarding China, I think again for China it's truly important to see Central Asia's friend as an immediate in its immediate neighborhood, and to see less presence of the countries which have some issues with China, and more presence of China, of course. And in my view, China, of course, besides seeing it as an immediate neighbor, while considering some investments, its foreign policy priorities, of course, rely on in general its global geopolitical thoughts about how to develop some spaces, how to develop relationship with other bigger powers and regions. So that's why I think China is now more interested in investing into the region as a part of its continental trade route. So it's facing fragilities in terms of sea routes. There are issues in this Southeast Asia trade routes. There were issues, and there was some instability in Pakistan. There were several attacks on Chinese citizens on this second alternative route. So there is this Central Asia can serve as another alternative continental transit route for China to keep important trade relations with Middle East, with Europe, and other continents. And finally, I would say China is also now more and more interested in cooperation with Central Asia on issues related to Afghanistan. It's in general linked to the increased interest of China in Afghanistan, its good relations with Taliban, and its proactive policy in supporting the current de facto authorities of the country. And in this regard, it's establishing close cooperation, not just with Central Asia, but with all other neighbors of Afghanistan. In general, concluding my remarks, I would say I don't see a big shift between the role which China and Russia played before war in Ukraine and currently. And I don't think that China, first of all, I'm not a big fan of this popular narrative that there is kind of division of duties in the region, and in the new condition and the current situation, I don't think that also the situation changed substantially from this condition which it used to be before 2020. Thank you.
Okay, this is already great. I appreciate the panelists keeping succinct in their presentations. It gives us quite a lot of time for discussion now. I'll encourage the audience to continue to post their questions, and after we sort of have a moderated discussion here, we'll turn it over to bringing in those discussion questions as well. So perhaps if I were to sort of identify two themes that come out, I'll use those as a platform to sort of start questions back to Bob, but also for across the group. So one would be on looking at the power transition across multiple instruments of national power. So we'll talk about that first. And then maybe second, we'll talk about this kind of competition, cooperation paradigm of the Russia-China relationship broadly, and then how it's executed in Central Asia. So first, the issue of sort of the power transition and thinking about instruments of power. A lot of the discussion thus far has been on sort of diplomatic and economic instruments of power. And so that's perhaps maybe, Bob, you can take on some of those, But I'd also encourage you to also think about the informational and military instruments of power and where they fit into this power dynamic as well. So Akram sort of brought up that question of security dimensions, perhaps where maybe Russia has still some asymmetries in the power dynamic. And then Izada brought up the informational. Again, there's obviously regional diversity, but also age diversity in terms of how information is conveyed in the region. So maybe to respond to some of those ideas, and then maybe if there are other thoughts from the commentators after Bob's response, we'll take that up.
Sure. Thanks, Michael. So yeah, I also flagged Izada's comment on information, right? Because in most governments, when they look at instruments of power, they use the D, the I, the M, and E: diplomacy, information, military, and economic instruments. Possibly just because it spells diamond, we love acronyms, but nevertheless, it's a useful framework. Information got to be so challenging to sort of not quantify, but to analyze, to take an analytical approach to in a report of this length, that I just sort of excluded it. But Izada's point, your point that older Russian speakers tend to be much more receptive to Russia's narrative on the war in Ukraine, I think is interesting and instructive, and it speaks to the effect of information. I did a book project recently on China-Russia relations, and the only chapter where I was able to actually look at information as an instrument and see how it was being deployed was in a chapter on China's response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I had a research assistant, Chinese speaking, and I essentially asked her to watch a month of Russian Chinese state news and categorize everything they were saying on Ukraine. So in a short, sort of in a discrete situation or discrete event, I think it's easier to analyze information. But I was just unable to really take a look at it in this report. But you're absolutely right that it has an effect. Governments know it has an effect, and they use it, all governments, to their advantage. There was an argument to be made the Chinese and Russians use it a little less responsibly than many other governments in terms of absolute pure fabrication sometimes, especially in Russia's case. But it is important and should be looked at. This is one of those avenues for future or further research or unanswered questions in the report. Yeah, and in terms of the military instrument, I think what you're seeing is Russia, due to the imperial and Soviet legacy, had a large military presence, and still does, in the region, right? I mean, Russia controlled the Tajik-Afghan border for over a decade after the collapse of the Soviet Union. There are still some 7,000 or so Russian troops in Tajikistan. There are 500 at Khan Air Base in Kyrgyzstan, which is a fairly small presence, but it's an important power projection platform for the Russian Air Force, especially. So Russia's presence in Central Asia, military presence, is overt, conventional, and large. China's is rising and is less overt. Like I said, the base in Tajikistan and Gorno-Badakhshan, neither government wanted to acknowledge it for years, and they finally have had to. And there's recent agreement that there would be another base built that would be turned over to the Tajik government, so that it looks like that this base may double in size. China's presence is People's Armed Police and PMSCs, private military and security contractors, not overt sort of People's Liberation Army troops, but nevertheless, it's significant and it's rising. Yeah, in terms of the cooperation competition paradigm, Akram, you mentioned you're not a fan of the sheriff and the banker argument, which is it's sort of like the strategic partnership axis of convenience. They're ideal types, right? They're bumper stickers that are sort of useful in framing the debate about how China and Russia interact in Central Asia. But I do think it's true that China for a long time was willing to let Russia play primary security manager. But as its economic interests in the region have expanded, and as it has faced a backlash to BRI investments in Central Asia in a way that a public backlash, for instance, in a way that it doesn't in China. The BRI in Africa. The BRI in Africa is fairly popular. All the public opinion polls, and when I was there doing field research for this book project, the experts I talked to, fairly positive view of the BRI. Central Asia is different. There's a lot of public skepticism about the Belt and Road Initiative due to the fact that there's probably endemic corruption, that publics in the region realize that elites are benefiting from the BRI in a way that the publics are not. And so there has been some action by regional governments to force the Chinese to hire a specific number of local workers and not bring in all Chinese workers, or pay a specific wage. And I think that's important. But China's security presence is really, to this point, it's protecting BRI investments, and it's also protecting itself, Xinjiang, from what it sees as potential instability emanating from the region or emanating from Afghanistan and moving through Central Asia. So I think the biggest divergence of interest, or the biggest area of competition, is in the economic realm. I think their military or security interests and diplomatic interests are fairly aligned. The security interests are, they both want to protect themselves from both instability emanating from the region or from Afghanistan through the region. Diplomatically or politically, I think they both have an interest in what they would call stability of the regional governments, the prevention of what both call color revolutions, right, which they see as coups against Russia or China-friendly regimes inspired by the Western intelligence services, and we see as popular uprisings that overthrow corrupt authoritarian regimes. And we are never going to see those things, that phenomenon, the same way as the Chinese and the Russians do. But I think they share an interest in preventing color revolutions. So diplomatically and militarily, I think their interests are largely aligned. It's in the economic realm where I think competition has already emerged. And I think it's inexorable. I think China's economic weight and interest in the region is such that Russia's just not. There has been a bump in Russian trade since the war in Ukraine, but we know a lot of that is sort of soft sanctions evasion and countries importing things from the West and then exporting it on to Russia. I don't think that trade bump is sustainable over the long term. So I just see the economic instrument as the one where their interests are most divergent, most misaligned, and I really don't see a Russian answer for China's economic weight. And I'll turn it back over for reactions from the panelists.
Yeah, perhaps we could go, if you like, in the reverse order. So maybe start with Akram, if you like.
Yeah, thank you. I think I was the last speaker before Robert take the lead. Regarding BRI, I think it's not very much a thing now. There is a lot of emphasis on this from the Chinese side. I think the brand of BRI was perceived a bit negatively, and there was a lot of media discussions which made the brand of BRI not very positive. That's why I think now China is focusing more on, at least in terms of Central Asia, on this China-Central Asia Forum. So there is a lot of emphasis on this region plus China cooperation, and I think China also is not quite happy with the developments of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, that it is stuck in permanent discussion without capability to take any important decisions, and there are a lot of internal struggles between the member states, which are preventing it from full efficiency. And in these circumstances, China is putting more emphasis on this region plus China format. And I think we will see more and more happening in this platform rather than on Shanghai Cooperation Organization or bilateral. I think China is really also following the tendency in Central Asia that there is a lot of discussions and a lot of activities on a regional level, and it's also trying to catch up to this new reality and focus more on this C5 plus one form. Thank you.
Aizad, thank you.
Yes, yeah, I think the economic realm is, it has been where Chinese and Russian interests were divergent. I think since mid-2000s and 2010s, we could see it from Russia's objection to SCO's expansion to the economic realm, possible free trade zone. Russia was quite sensitive to that in the past. And the very emergence of Eurasian Economic Union can also demonstrate that Russia also wants to be economically present or dominant in Central Asia. And I think it can be also palpable in the energy sector, where Russia has advantage as a result of former Soviet infrastructure, and Russia has leverages there. And the perfect illustration can be the recent so-called gas union or energy project, where Russia can put Central Asian countries into newly dependent situations. And it's quite maybe risky for Central Asian countries, but it looks like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, due to shortages of gas, they agreed to get Russian gas. So this is where Russia can use its leverages and show that its interests with China can diverge. But other than that, yeah, in other aspects, in terms of military, political aspects, it looks like Russia cannot afford to be quite in opposition to China. So maybe we will see this, as some analysts put it, a quiet competition in using those existing post-Soviet infrastructure in regards to China. But other than that, it looks like Russia, Sino-Russian no limits partnership is going to stay there. Thank you.
And Ed, thanks.
Yeah, just to talk a little bit about security, I think, as you mentioned in the report, historically there was certainly a deference from China towards Russia. When it went to set up its base that you mentioned in the Pamir in Tajikistan back in 2016, there was apparently a meeting between officials from both countries to kind of map out red lines and to inform them of this plan. As you say, historically, in most of military exercises and China's security cooperation with the region was primarily through the SCO, of which of course Russia is a member. But I think certainly we've seen, we've seen, as you mentioned in the report, the types of security assistance being offered by China, mostly kind of law enforcement, paramilitary, working with security services, is a little different to the more mil-mil type cooperation that we see between Russia and the Central Asian militaries. And so those are all things that have dampened competition between the two countries. But I think, as we mentioned in the panel, they certainly have moved increasingly in a more independent direction. This increase in exports came at the expense of other countries, Ukraine, Turkey, and various other players in the Central Asian arms market have been not totally pushed out, but partially pushed out by China's rise. But over time, we're going to see potentially competition in that sphere as well. So certainly the trend lines point towards increasing potential for least friction between the two in security.
Okay, well, let me pivot a little bit. We've got some outstanding questions from our audience, so I'm going to start to bring in some of these. We'll get a little bit more focused. The first one I'll draw out is a question on the development of the middle corridor as a manifestation of the Russia-China competition, and possibly as a forum for cooperation, sort of that east-west trade between Europe and China. So how do you view the impact of this idea of the middle corridor being a part of this discussion? Bob, first.
Sure. I think it's a manifestation of China's overall approach to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which I would call mostly self-interested. So Russia or China has avoided doing anything that it knows would trigger secondary sanctions on it, while it has sold things to Russia that it knows and everyone knows are dual use and benefited. It's turned the economic relationship between Russia and China into almost a colonial relationship, where China imports raw materials from Russia and exports finished goods, often replacing things that Russia got from Western countries, machines, vehicles, aircraft, that type of thing, before the sanctions hit. And so the Chinese interest there is a lot more Chinese interest in the Middle Corridor because it represents an alternative pathway to Western markets that excludes Russia and therefore insulates China from the effect of sanctions on Russia. So it's just it's a logical, rational, self-interested approach, I think, on the part of the Chinese government.
Thank you. And so by exception, if there are any other thoughts from our other commentators. Okay, let us move on. I'll pick up actually maybe a thread in a second question here on the relationship with India. So we haven't talked about India thus far, obviously a major economic and security, shall we say, actor in this region. So how do you see India's rise impacting some of the dynamics that you're comparing now with Russia and China in Central Asia? And maybe I'll throw in Iran to the question and discussion as well, because again, as we think through the Middle Corridor and East-West trade, Russia is talking more about North-South trade as well. So first we'll take on India, and then maybe if we could talk about as a group Iran as well, and maybe re-engage that original theme that came out in the discussion on the sort of the axis of convenience or axis of upheaval, as Andrea Kendall-Taylor has been talking about recently, which also includes Iran. And of course, when you think about the three, Russia, China, and Iran, of course, that sort of envelops Central Asia geographically. So Iran and India, please. Bob first.
Well, I'll preface it by saying I'm an expert on neither India nor Iran, but so it occurs to me that in terms of India, so India has long been interested in the region. Early on, I think its interest in the region was largely hedging against Pakistan. India was interested in Afghanistan and Central Asia because it took away Pakistan's strategic depth against India. I think it's developed into a more genuine interest in the region. And again, I'm not equipped to talk specific Indian interests in the region, security, economic, or diplomatic, but you do see more interest and more presence, not only India, but even players like Japan and Korea, and of course Turkey. It just occurs to me that inserting India into the relationship immediately complicates the China-Russia relationship because they have such different relationships with India, right? Russia and India have a long-standing partnership, and China and India have been long-standing sort of adversaries. In terms of Iran, yeah, Iran has had an interest in the region, I guess particularly Tajikistan, because it shares sort of ethnic and linguistic links with the Tajiks, but I don't know. I'd like to hear from the other panelists. I don't see Iran as a major or significantly rising player in the region, but I'll also admit that I haven't studied Iran specifically. So let me turn it over to everybody else and see what they think.
I can comment on this. I think the factor of India is getting more significance to Central Asia in terms of, again, this transport corridors. But here is definitely impact of war in Ukraine. Now this road to India is important, not just for Central Asia, but for Russia. Because Russia is seeing South Asia as one of the important regions which can be kind of substitute for gas supply, for trade exchanges, and substituting former European partners in many aspects. So that's why I think the transit route to India is one of the important areas where Russia would like to have more focus, and more cooperation with Central Asia. And it's also in line with interests of India to establish this transport connectivity with Central Asia and further with Europe and other continents. In this regard, there is a merge of interests, I would say, of India and China in terms of middle corridor. I think middle corridor is beneficial not just for China or Central Asia as a transit hub, but also for India as an alternative continental route to Europe.
If I could provide a brief remark on that in regards to India, India's presence. I think India has been constrained because of geography. There is a willingness to be present in Central Asia, but it's still constrained. There are some constraints. But on the societal levels, compared to China, India has a great public appeal in Central Asia. And there are lots of thousands of Indian students who are studying in Central Asian countries, mostly in medical faculties. And it's not causing any societal clashes or misunderstandings. And in that sense, India has a advantage compared to China culturally, and maybe in the future India will try to capitalize on that when approaching Central Asia. But yeah, we'll wait and see.
If I may, I think India's relations with the region's been characterized by kind of lofty goals and ambitions and general underperformance. If we look at Indian trade with the region, it stands at about $2 billion, whereas trade with China stands at $89 billion. So the two are in vastly different playing fields, again, constrained by geography. And so certainly there's been plans to develop closer ties that haven't fully become realized. I think there's a link between Iran and India insofar as India is supporting the building of the operation of the Chabahar port, right? So that also aligns with Russia's interest in developing its own southern trade corridors via Iran into the Indian Ocean. So there's some convergence of interests between the Central Asian republics, India and Iran, and Russia to some degree. In that regard. Regarding Iran's relations with the region, again, I would say similar. Its role in the region has not, if you look at some of the analyses of the early 1990s, where there were ideas that there would be very close relations between Tajikistan and Iran, linguistic, cultural affinities, as Bob mentioned, those haven't come to pass, and that relationship between Iran and Tajikistan has certainly could be characterized as one that's been something of a roller coaster rides of ups and downs, and more recently on the upward trajectory, but the recent death of Raisi and uncertainty in Iran will mean that relationship is somewhat thrown up in the air once more. So I would say both countries that have interest in the region, but ultimately have not played as extensive roles as some of their rhetoric would suggest.
Okay, pivoting back to a security question, I'm going to bin 2 questions from our audience. So the first will be on CSTO. So how do the panelists explain the inclusion of a statement in the recent Xi-Putin agreement that China would expand cooperation with the Collective Security Treaty Organization, or CSTO, on Eurasian security? Does this indicate Sino-Russian agreement on a greater security role for China in Central Asia, or is this an effort to manage future PRC actions in the security realm for the region? That's the first question. And I will add a question on how you see China as taking on a greater role as a security guarantor for the region in Central Asia. I mean, we're already seeing this in Tajikistan, but does this expand? And perhaps even provide then a future wedge against Russian aggression, particularly in light of Russian officials, occasionally musing on the topic of liberating areas of northern Kazakhstan, which were done after the Ukrainian invasion. And then Xi Jinping's comments publicly about believing in the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Central Asian states. So again, these are things that have been said in the past, and then how do you envision them in the future? So we'll start with Bob, and then maybe we'll go forward this time with Ed following. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, on the CSTO, I think so. Two ways to look at it, and both could be partially right. One is Xi and Putin routinely make lofty, expansive statements of cooperation that then pay no actual dividends. They've been saying for years that the Eurasian Economic Union and the Silk Road Economic Belt are going to merge. They haven't and they won't. They can't. They're incompatible. And so there's that. Another way to look at it, I think, as the question mentioned, is maybe an attempt to bind Russia into a cooperation, or I'm sorry, an attempt by Russia to bind China into a cooperation framework that ensures Russia's in the room. I was talking to an American diplomat in Kazakhstan who said, look, the entire idea of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization was that the Russians didn't want the Chinese in a room alone with the Central Asians. And that's why Russia was a proponent of the SCO. And so this may be a version of that. Russia now, why would Xi Jinping agree to do it? I'm not sure. Maybe he doesn't actually intend to do it. Maybe it's another one of those statements like the Eurasian Economic Union and Silk Road Economic Belt. It's a lofty, expansive statement of intention that never transitions into practice. So I don't know. I'd like to hear from the other panelists.
I think that's a valid interpretation for sure. If we look back in January 2022, with the bloody Kazakhstan events, right, mass protests and the violent crackdown on those protests and instability, and we saw the CSTO intervening to help stabilize Tokayev's government. And then the foreign minister of Kazakhstan gave an interview shortly afterwards where he said the Chinese side was willing to help, but we were willing to explore that and have some kind of Chinese intervention of some description. It was very vague, but there was no legal framework with which to do it. Right, the CSTO as a collective treaty, as a collective defense organization, Tokayev could trigger this international terrorism. This attack on the country from outside forces was legitimate cause to have this foreign intervention. But within the case of China, there was no such agreement. So I think Russia probably viewed that with concern, and coupled with the statements, as we mentioned, Xi Jinping's first visit outside of China after the pandemic to Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, where he reaffirmed their sovereignty and territorial integrity in the wake of continued Russian threats, particularly to Kazakhstan. I think there's certainly, I would say, that binding logic, and Russia trying to keep closer tabs on China within the region regards to its potential for interventions is certainly a potential logic here. But I would say it's also very possible and very likely that this is merely hot air, and they're not going to materialize into anything more meaningful. I mean, we can see the China joining the CSTO, for example. So it's very vague as to what closer cooperation will entail.
Yeah, if I could quickly add on that, I think that would contradict China's non-interference principle, which is part of China's 5 principles of peaceful coexistence that it has been promoting since the mid-1950s. So what China did during the January events in Kazakhstan was to watch very cautiously and very carefully. But what those statements about supporting the territorial integrity and sovereignty mean, I think it's an open question. We don't know what China means by that. But basically, obviously, its stance is very cautious when it comes to domestic political developments or upheavals.
Okay. If I could,
please,
Michael, since I actually left the second half of your question unanswered, and that is, and Edward and Izada both addressed it. I think it's interesting to look at this through the lens of, Izada, you brought up sort of Central Asian agency in your first set of remarks, right? And you're correct that the report largely left that unaddressed just for issues of space. But in the book chapter that the report's loosely based on, there is a section on agency and regional cooperation and the development of a regional identity. It's important. I think it's interesting to ask whether, because some people, elites in Central Asia, are openly talking about looking for alternative security partners and openly mentioning that China is the most obvious choice. So I wonder if the agency of Central Asian states, who could lead in terms of a security partnership, Russia's been very jealous of its role as the sole security provider, but a lot of Central Asians, I think, now don't want to see Russia as the sole security manager and are looking for other partners, as well as potentially looking to regional cooperation as a way to manage their own security. I just wonder how Russia will react to that. And I wonder how China will react to that, to being approached by, for instance, President Tokayev in Kazakhstan to take a larger role in the region, in managing security of the region. I just wonder how that might play out.
Good, Bob, and building on that, we have a question from the audience on this, the question of intra-regionalism, and then again, thinking through how much has changed in Central Asia in terms of elites in the region working together and thinking together as they sort of negotiate relations with Russia and with China and other actors geopolitically in the region and in the world, obviously Europe, the United States, Iran, and India. So could you talk a little bit about this kind of change and development and sort of the intra-regional perspective? And then a flip side, same person, but also a very good question on the differences between the different Central Asian states when it comes to their Russia and China engagements. We've generally in this conversation kind of taken them together with some occasional mentions of Tajikistan and Kazakhstan, but certainly Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan. We have a participant today where we haven't heard much about sort of those individual states and how maybe there are some interesting perspectives or interesting anecdotes that we could just sort of draw out a perspective on those relationships. Bob.
Yeah, those are both great themes, great questions. In terms of intra-regionalism or development of regional cooperation and regional identity, I guess I would say there's theory and practice. In theory, everyone knows, all the elites, all the governments know that they would be better off if they could cooperate and present a united front to external actors, because it would reduce the leverage external actors have over them, because they'd be dealing with a sort of a collective of 5 states instead of 5 individual states. An analyst in Kazakhstan tell me that his sort of vision is a Central Asian energy community loosely modeled on the European coal and steel community, right, which developed into the European Union. In other words, that with the initial impetus of the European Union was to remove the economic incentives for France and Germany to go to war against each other, and then eventually that developed into what we have today. His idea was, look, the energy resources are distributed fairly unevenly throughout Central Asia. Kazakhstan has a large part of the oil, Turkmenistan a large part of the gas, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan are hydropowers. If there were a community of energy and there were no it was shared sort of more equitably, then that could develop into something bigger. Now, the practice is Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan fought a war against each other recently, right? Within the last couple of years, year or two. While their presidents were, I think weren't they in Tashkent, Akram, at the either SCO or CSTO summit? So there's that. And there's so I don't know. I think intra-regionalism, development of regional identity and regional cooperation is the right thing to do. I think there are pretty significant obstacles to getting there. In terms of the difference in the countries, I obviously would defer to the experts on the region from the region. But in terms of what I saw as an approach to Russia, I saw a lot more skepticism in Kazakhstan, I think, than anywhere else, for obvious reasons. You mentioned it earlier, Michael. It's Dmitry Medvedev and Margarita Asanova and the rest of the sort of chattering classes in Russia routinely make threatening statements toward Kazakhstan. I think Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are much more dependent upon Russia. We haven't talked about labor and remittances, but that's a massive source of sort of negative Russian economic leverage over those two countries. Uzbekistan as well, but to a lesser extent. So I guess I would just say that on the differences among the countries, and then defer to the actual regional experts for some more context.
Akram, you want to lead us off here?
Yes. Regarding inter-regionalism, it's true that in recent years, especially as I also mentioned earlier, that it's increasing substantially, and it's also affecting how the external actors are choosing the ways of interaction with the region. As I mentioned, China and Russia, they both established at the last big external actors who established this C5+1 formats. Many other countries did so before. They were one of the last who also started this kind of platform. So again, this is an acknowledgement of a new dynamics in Central Asia, and it's becoming more, I wouldn't say united, but there is slightly more coordination than it used to be. And this coordination is truly important, especially in the current circumstances. The fact that there is coordination, there are regular discussions how to build up relations with external actors, not just with Russia and China, but with many others, is truly important for agency and sovereignty of Central Asia. Regarding the second part of your question, the differences of the regional countries. Yeah, of course, we are generalizing, but there are a lot of nuances if we go in depth of cooperation between, let's say, Kyrgyzstan and China, or Uzbekistan, China. There are differences, and of course, we need to get into account the size of the country, its capacity in terms of population, economic growth, its GDP, and etc. All these factors matter when you deal with external actors. Maybe bigger countries have some more space for maneuver. Smaller countries are a bit limited in terms of again maneuver, but not just the size, but availability of resources is important. Of course, a lot of attention in the region in terms of external actors are getting mainly Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, and of course it's affecting the possibility to be more flexible for smaller countries like Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. All these details matter.
If I may add on the regional cooperation, I think like Akram, I'm also more optimistic when it comes to Central Asian regional cooperation. I think especially with the war in Ukraine, they're trying to express their collective stance when it comes to external excursions. For instance, in the joint statement, which was prepared as a result of the Cholpon-Atan meeting in July 2022, the Central Asian countries for the first time included the new principle in the joint statement, the principle of inviolability of state borders, along with the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity. And I think they are on the same page, and they are trying to express their collective position when it comes to external threats. Yeah, I think there is more coordination. They express that they're willing to work together, but it doesn't mean that there are obstacles. There are existing problems, as we have mentioned, between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. Some passivity from Turkmenistan. That's why Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan are encouraging Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan and Turkmenistan to sign the agreement on friendship and good neighborliness in Central Asia. So I think that this expectation is still present for the upcoming consultative meetings, which will be in August in Astana. So we'll see what happens.
Ed, anything to
just
add?
to reflect on my initial points around agency and responses. Certainly, there's a hierarchy internationally, I would argue, and there's also a hierarchy within Central Asia, as we know. Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan by far the best placed to pursue this multi-vector foreign policy, right? They have the largest populations, economies, they have the things that are of greatest interest to external partners. And so when compared with the two smallest countries in the region, economically weakest, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, their ability to leverage these relationships and pursue strategic autonomy and take advantage of this potential growing competition or China's rise is much lower. Right? When we look at Tajikistan, for example, half of its economy comes from remittances sent back from Russia, which even in the wake of reprisals as a result of the Crocus City terrorist attack in Moscow in March, we have seen some reduction in migration, but we've not seen a massive reduction in migration because it's just the lifeline for the country's economy. And so we see dependence on China in terms of external debt, in terms of trade and investment. We see dependence on Russia in terms of security, particularly for Tajikistan. So I think we need to look at the region from the perspective of some of the common trends and common interests and commonalities, but at the same time, each of the countries' relations with these external powers and ability to leverage those relations definitely differs.
Okay, so we have about 8 minutes left. And what I'm going to do is we're going to move into a bit of a speed round here. So I think I can bin most of the questions into 2 sets. So the first will be on the question of soft power. So think about the methods that China is now using in the Central Asian region. Are there some aspects perhaps where China is more effective than Russia in using soft power? Another gets really specific into specifically the Chinese effort to have Central Asian states sign on to a community with a shared future for mankind concept, and whether that sort of view of a Sinocentric order has perhaps a possibility to integrate Central Asia into that view. And then another question on how China and Russia are looking towards the younger generation in Central Asia, and perhaps talk about some of the aspects there. And if we have time, we can pivot to a last set of questions on Xinjiang. So Bob, over to you first.
Okay. On soft power, so China, we like to panic in the West, in the US, especially about the Confucius Institutes as some sort of insidious Chinese, attempt to build its soft power. I didn't, in the field research I did in Central Asia and Africa, I could barely find anyone who knew what a Confucius Institute was or where it was. The one I was able to find was closed because no students were there and they locked it up. So yes, China's attempting. Educational exchanges are another. Lots of people go to China on funded education exchanges, but I'd like to hear what Aizada and Akram think about this, but my discussions with people in the region led me to believe that a Russian education is still far more highly valued than a Chinese education. I don't know if that's the case universally, but again, I was talking mostly to elites. I wasn't doing public opinion surveys, but that's the impression I was getting. Most people would prefer to go to Russia. So Russia really does have, if Russia believed in soft power, which it doesn't, it believes in hard power only, it has a massive soft power advantage in Central Asia that it could leverage. And finally, I think China runs into, Aizada, you mentioned it earlier, the cultural or even civilizational difference. China is in this difficult position in Central Asia of being seen as the other culturally or civilizationally, but being close enough culturally and maybe ethnically that people believe it's possible that they could be swallowed demographically by an expanding China and swallowed economically. So it's in this really difficult cultural, civilizational space to manage. In terms of the shared future for all of mankind, China's really working to institutionalize all of its security, development, and diplomatic initiatives. There's that. There's the Global Security Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, the Belt and Road Initiative. And it really is, I think, an attempt to build an alternative to what China sees as the U.S. hegemonic order, and what we see as the rules-based order or the liberal order. It's an alternative model of global governance. Younger generation, I would have to defer to people from the region on that. Julie Chen, who actually, I think she may be on, or no, I'm not sure if she's on, but she's an expert in this, and she's a professor at University of Helsinki. She's done some excellent research on the attitudes of college students, of younger people toward China. And so really I would refer people to that research, because it really is instructive. It finds that there's a lot of skepticism, even among younger generations. It also finds that, as Izada mentioned earlier, the media they consume has a large influence on how they see Russia and China. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, first Izada, and then Akram.
Yeah,
And then I think we'll have to pivot to some closing comments from Bob.
yeah, I'll try to be brief. In regards to soft power methods by China, I think the scholarship on soft power, on Chinese soft power, concludes that Chinese soft power efforts mostly failed in Central Asian countries. And I think Chinese leadership is aware of that, and they are trying to be quite innovative in this regard. That's why they changed the management of the Confucius Institutes in 2020. Now it's managed by non-governmental foundation, Chinese International Education Foundation. But it looks like how Confucian Institutes operate hasn't changed much since then. And another innovative way coming from China is the establishment of Luban workshops in Central Asian countries. Now there are 2 of them in Tajikistan and in Kazakhstan, and mainly it's aimed at training local people in operating using Chinese equipment, because that was the major critique coming from Central Asian public, that Chinese companies, they bring their own workforces, and specifically the establishment of Luban workshops is done in order to address this question. So I think China is still trying to adapt and come up with innovative solutions.
Yeah, very quickly, I think in terms of soft power, Russia has maybe slightly more advantage as with its Russian media and the language, the absence of big language barrier, but actually the usage of Russian language is, in my view, is declining in the recent years across Central Asia. There is more and more interest, first of all, to local languages, but also at the same time, English is now very popular. In Tashkent, you can find so many language centers which are teaching English as a foreign language. But in terms of educational opportunities, China is now providing more and more scholarships to the students from the region. So it might not look like right now that the interest is not that big, but I think gradually it will evolve to something bigger. More and more the young generation will be studied in China. They will have better understanding of China. There will be less language barriers. So this soft power element will equally improve. Russia still has strong presence in terms of education. There are many branches of Russian universities in Central Asia. But so there is kind of a competition. But anyway, European or American universities has slightly more advantage both before Russian or Chinese. Thank you.
Okay, Bob, we've left you with almost no time, we'll say, available, but we'll turn it over to you for closing comments.
I would just say, I think I've said everything I wanted to say on the topic. I would just offer thanks. Thanks to Russia's Strategic Initiative for sponsoring the event. Thanks to you, Michael, for moderating. Thanks to the panel. You guys were fantastic. It's so good to have people from the region when we're talking about the region, especially. Thanks to Ed for the introduction to Izada and Akram. And thanks, of course, to the audience members for tuning in. Thanks for the great questions. It was a really good discussion. I learned a lot. I took notes and have 5 or 6 pages of notes. So thanks, everybody.